very dangerous world. And I do not want to sit in what I now consider to be my cheap seat,
right,
and without full information. And like you said, we don't know what the projects are. I can't really calculate this. My concern is the breakdown of trust, because in leading, as I point out repeatedly in the book that Bing and I wrote, trust is the coin of the realm when you're in a leadership position. And so are we building trust among the decision makers in Washington? Again, and I think that starts with defining a problem, quantifying the problem to the degree you can, so that at least you have some known facts that everyone agrees on, and then deciding what to do about it. I'm not in a position, I think, to walk out of the administration over a policy disagreement, right, and then become a critic. I believe in what the French call a duty of quiet, a devoir de reserve. And the reason is, I don't want to add to what's simply right now the corrosive political debates. I don't think it's helpful. I don't think it's necessary.
So to that point, I mean, earlier in the conversation, we talked about our values being worth defending. And with all due respect, obviously national security secrets and issues you can't speak on, but there's so much to say about the damage being done to our alliances, the breakdown of our core values, the respect for the basics of our Constitution. At what point, when is it time to stand up and speak to what is happening? And you may call it the cheap seats, but you have a lot more insight and credibility than anybody who's ever been at this table. And at what point
Except maybe
is it
Barnacle.
important to say something or become part of the problem, because we know what is happening, we see what is happening, and yet nobody speaks to it with the insight that perhaps someone you would have, like you.
Well, I don't know how I could have spoken more loudly to where I stand than what I put in my letter of resignation and quitting a job when I had not completed it 2 years in. I think, too, this goes back several administrations. This didn't start overnight. This isn't about one man. And the solution's not going to be about one person speaking out. It's going to be about the majority of Americans saying that's enough. We owe better to the next generation than what we're doing right now. But we grew up in the luckiest generation, all of us at this table. The greatest generation raised us. We are not turning that over to the next generation.
Right. Weren't you helped, I'm sorry, weren't you helped, though, by reading Robert Gates' book, where he talked about the shortcomings of the presidents he worked for? Wasn't that helpful to you as you prepared for your role?
It was very helpful, and each of the former secretaries of defense from both Republican and Democrat administrations immediately made themselves available, would come and have lunch with me.
Right.
The point I would make there is that what the right-wing Senator Vandenberg from Michigan said when challenged, why do you work with that terrible Democrat President Truman? And he said the defense of the country is a nonpartisan issue, basically. Right. He said politics ends at the water's edge. What is the institution that is most admired and the American public has the most confidence in polls year after year? It's the military. Why is that? Because we're apolitical. We stay out of the politics. We defend the experiment that you and I call America.
So is there a statute of limitations?
There probably on policy and strategy.
Yes.
There will come a time, not right now,
what
when
about competence and character to actually be
I believe that
Commander-in-Chief?
political assessments should be left to the wisdom of the American people.
Let me ask you
I have this much. Well, let me just make a point. General Bradley, after World War II, was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he said when a general retires their uniform, they should retire their tongue on these kinds of issues. And the reason is, when I walked into your studios this morning, people greeted me as General Mattis. Now, I consider myself Jim Mattis. I'm from the West, and I'm Jim. But I will be forever, in some people's eyes, a general. And I think we have a tradition that goes back over 200 years, George Washington, George Marshall, that military people do not dictate or pass evaluations on political leaders or tell the American people, this is the way you should be thinking. Or maybe some people would misinterpret it and say, he's telling the uniformed military now how they should be voting. I don't think this is helpful at all.
Well, yeah, and I will remind my wife, hey honey, that Dr. Brzezinski,
Oh, true.
who Dr. Brzezinski, I don't know if you all knew this or not, he had opinions, lots of opinions. And he always shared those opinions. But in the 10, 15 years that I knew him, in the most private of conversations, he never once said anything negative about Jimmy Carter, his commander-in-chief. It was always positive, and if you tried to ever move him there, a wall went up. So I always respected and admired him for that. We think, though, you shouldn't make an exception before the 2020 election. Let's get back to, because I don't want to, what's fascinating about this book is it's a great book on leadership, and it reminds, some things you say here reminds me of another book that's really changed the way I think about recruiting talent, in the book called Range. But you say in here early on, you recruit for attitude. You train for skill sets. I mean, they change. 10 years from now, so many skills are just going to be obsolete. Talk about, I'd love for both of you to talk about recruiting for attitude, because that, you said, that's a weapon in and of itself.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because we started this book in 2013 because I had spent so much time on the battlefields with Jim. Later, he's become this statesman. You want to talk about the large level things in the state capitals and the capital of our country, etc. But much of this book is about story, about leading when Jim first had a platoon, and then 40 men, and then 400 men, then 4,000 men, and what he had to learn about leadership as he went along. It's story after story.
You know, Bing, what you just said gets to you and your life. And you said to Mika that you don't want to be speaking from the cheap seats. You, almost more than anyone I know, paid for your cheap seat. Paid for it in blood and treasure and the leadership of men who you lost. And so, a year ago tomorrow, someone, I don't know who, wrote an anonymous op-ed in the New York Times. And in part, they wrote this: to be clear, ours is not the popular resistance of the left. We want the administration to succeed and think that many of its policies have already made America safer and more prosperous. But we believe our first duty is to this country, and the president continues to act in a manner that is detrimental to the health of our republic. The root of the problem is the president's immorality. Anyone who works with him knows he is not moored to any discernible first principles that guide his decision-making. Do you agree with that?
I wouldn't comment on it other than to say that I've never believed in cowardice. If I felt that strongly about something, I would have signed it. I would have been right up front about it. I think you would owe that degree of candor. But I think, too, we have to look at this as a test of everyone's character in America. Again, I don't think that we have a problem today that suddenly mushroomed into our observation and what we're seeing here in the last 6 months, last 2 years, or last 5 years. I think this is a growing problem inside America. We've lost a fundamental friendliness with one another. We've lost a sense of fairness. We really believe, in some cases, there are people who believe I'm right about everything and that guy's wrong about everything. And if we don't wake up to the idea that the people we disagree with are fellow Americans, if we don't understand that once in a while the people we disagree with are actually right, and if we don't roll up our sleeves and start working together, then we're going to have a problem in this experiment, because this was set up so it would not work without cooperation, collaboration, and compromise. It was set up that way with 3 co-equal branches of government, and just to add more problems to it, there's a bicameral legislature. So we're going to have to address this in less personal terms than whether or not we agree with a condemnation of any single political leader, because I'm sure I can find a letter just as damning about people on the left. This is the very problem we face right now. Instead of being hard on the issues, we're hard on each other. And we actually let the issues go. I mean, you're talking about issues here this morning that we've not